everyone, my name's Ed Hamer. We run Chagfood CSA. We started in 2010 on 1 acre, and we've gradually increased the area and the membership over the past 12 years. We're now growing on about 7 acres, supplying 150 shares a week to our local community and our 5 local parishes. That's just to give you a brief overview. I'm going to go into a bit more depth about kind of our startup process and our governance and finance stuff in a bit. But just wanted to give you a brief overview of where we are and what we do. For those of you who don't know, CSA as a concept first emerged from Japan in the 1980s with a pilot project, which was actually inspired by a market in Osaka in Japan, in a single farmer's market, basically, where there was a group of consumers who noticed that the farmers coming to the market each week the number of farmers coming to the market were declining each week. And they started questioning why that was happening, why fewer and fewer farmers were turning up at the market. And it turned out that it's a very common problem with the farmers market model in the particularly small and medium scale growers. If you're growing a product for a direct market like that, there's no way of telling exactly how much product you're going to be able to sell each week at market. And with the result that more often than not, you tend to over harvest and overproduce in the expectation that at least you'll have stuff there if consumers turn up to buy it. But the problem was that the numbers at the market were fluctuating so erratically that there were lots of farmers producing and harvesting a lot of produce, taking it to market, and then experiencing an enormous amount of loss of that product because they weren't selling it. They would then have to take it home, feed it to the pigs or put it on the compost. And it's not just the time taken to harvest that product, it's the time, money and resources to actually grow that product from scratch, cultivate the soil, do the propagation, the sowings and all of that. So it represents a huge amount of energy and time. This group of enterprising consumers basically went to the growers at the farmers market and said, what about if we give you a guarantee of buying a certain volume of produce from you each week? Would that help to maintain your viability in the area? And it turns out that it did. It was a great idea, a great pilot, really. So that emerged or developed into the very first CSA community supported agriculture scheme. It got picked up in Germany and the USA in the late 80s and in the early 90s. And it wasn't actually until 1994 that we had our first CSA here in the UK, in Scotland, up at Findhorn. And from the very start, really, there's been 2 central tenets to the CSA model that actually really define community supported agriculture and set it apart from, particularly in the UK, from organic box schemes that actually emerged at a very similar time. But the thing that really sets CSA apart from box schemes is that you have, what I've got here really is this unifying principle. You have food producers and you have consumers and you have this annual commitment. And it's the annual commitment really that is the defining foundation of that central relationship between the subscription model between the producers and the consumers. And that's what gives the growers or the farmer a guaranteed market and supports the farm throughout the season. There's really a second amendment, which I've listed here, that actually is an element of all CSAs across the world. And that's really an acceptance that consumers are sharing the risks and the rewards of the farm. And what that means is that in a good year, if you get a bumper harvest, your consumers, your members, should in turn receive better quality and better quantity of produce than they would conversely in a bad year. Also in a bad year where there's a crop loss or a livestock loss, looking at livestock CSAs, your members accept that they're sharing that loss with the producer, so that they accept certainly poorer quality and yields in a bad year, and often they can accept that they're not receiving any meat from a livestock CSA if there's been a livestock incident. So those 2 principles are really absolutely essential to defining CSAs, in my opinion, and that's really what sets us apart from organic box schemes or organic local supply chains, which are equally as important, but at the same time they're not CSAs. So I think it's really important when you're starting out your CSA journey is to be very clear about what a CSA is and how it differs from the numerous box schemes that we have in the UK, which are also a great option as well. By 2010, there was around 300 or 400 organic local box schemes across the country. And I think that's quite a unique UK phenomenon. I went to the US in 2015, visited numerous CSAs over there, and they were actually quite struck by the contrast that actually in the UK, we had this organic box scheme model that was quite well known and quite extended. Whereas over there, the CSA model is really much more extensive, and it's much more normal to have a CSA in a local community. Just for context, in the US, there's about 3,500 CSAs across the US. I mean, I know it's a bigger area, but even taking that into account, it's been quite a dramatic increase of CSAs over there in the past 20 years. I just wanted to really highlight those two central tenets of the CSA model, because I think they're really important to grasp if you're thinking of going down the CSA route, and to have an understanding of where they came from. Without a doubt, the CSA model, one of the greatest things it does is provide security to the producers themselves and the growers or the farmers themselves. And then you don't have to have the preoccupation of where you're going to sell that produce, or setting aside specific time for harvesting produce to take to a market that may or may not sell. So that guaranteed market really underpins the entire viability of the CSA model, and it's really what makes it work. On top of that, the other thing that really is essential for CSAs is to have that direct connection with your consumers. And from a purely financial perspective, that again is what really makes CSAs viable on small scale, because we get 100% of the food pound. We're not paying anyone else for transport, retail, marketing, any of that. All of the consumer income comes directly to the farm, and then we use that money just for spending on running costs of the farm and on wages, nothing else. So again, that really underpins why it is viable to run CSAs even on a small scale for local communities. That's the key to achieving financial viability. Another really important element of CSAs is the social side, what I call the agricultural side of what we do. And this really is about reconnecting local communities to the seasons, to the weather conditions, to the landscape, and particularly the people who are producing their food. We live in a world today where we're increasingly disconnected from where our food comes from and how it's produced. And it seems to be increasingly difficult to actually re-establish those connections. So one of the central roles of all of the CSAs across the UK is to embrace that reconnection. And as Gareth was saying, really to hold social events, to make the farm open and accessible to local community, and particularly to the members, people who are subscribing to get their produce, so that they have an opportunity to come to the farm, to see the fields, to see your cropping or livestock systems, and to meet the growers and the farmers. And it's really that personal connection that underpins a huge amount of the loyalty that exists within CSA schemes, because it suddenly turns food from becoming an impersonal, transactional commodity that you can buy in any faceless shop, I suppose, to actually a product that has an identity and has people behind it. And I think that really encourages a huge amount of loyalty, certainly in our experience over the past 12 years, in terms of encouraging people to resubscribe year after year after year. And also this idea that they're not only buying for the product, they're not only paying for the product they receive that week in their veg share, they're actually investing in the farm long term, and they're investing in the skills, knowledge and experience of their growers to deliver resilience and food security for their community over a number of years. So I think all of those things combined really feed into the loyalty that underpins the CSA model, and that's certainly been our experience over the past 12 years. So I just want to run through very briefly the story of how we set up. This was back 2008. And just to give you a bit of context, for those of you who haven't been here, Chagford is quite a small market town, population just around 1,500. That's the whole parish, not just the town. And it's a largely pastoral landscape. It's got a strong agricultural heritage. It's a very agricultural landscape. There's a lot of livestock farms around the area, and it's got quite a strong independent food sector. So we've still got an independent butcher, baker, greengrocer, dairy, and a whole food shop. The demographic is kind of quite an equal split between professionals and commuters who travel to Exeter to work. Traditional farming community, low-income households, retired residents, and we do have quite a strong alternative artistic community as well, which was certainly supportive in terms of getting the scheme off the ground when we first started. Coincidentally, so my story with CSA really started in 2008. I was working as a journalist and for the Ecologist magazine, and got commissioned to write an article on CSA. And that involved, I just jumped in the car and drove up and down the country and visited the then 8 CSAs that were up and running. Met the growers, looked at the sites, got a feel for what it was about. And through doing that job, that really inspired me with the idea that, if I was going to do something to actually change the community where I grew up, establishing a CSA would be the most productive thing that I could do in my own town. So inspired by that, I came back home, and coincidentally at the same time, the New Economics Foundation organised a community meeting, which was kind of off the back of the transition town movement that was kind of blossoming at the time. And at that meeting, there was a huge appetite really for the return of a local market garden. There hadn't been a market garden in Chagford for about 50 years. And there was a clear demand identified for access to local, seasonal, fresh veg. That really was our inspiration for actually kickstarting the scheme in the first place. So over the course of about 3 or 4 months, we organised a few follow-up meetings. And then coincidentally, in about nearly a year later, in January 2009, the Big Lottery Fund launched their Making Local Food Work programme, which was a £65 million pot of money to kickstart local food schemes. CSA was identified as a key area of funding, and we were in a position, we had kind of done a lot of the groundwork, and we were in a position to get a funding bid in early on, which we did. We were actually the first CSA to get funded through the Making Local Food Work programme. And then over about a 12-month period, we did business planning, find a suitable site, and finally got a conditional offer in November 2009, conditional on getting planning permission from the Dartmoor National Park for the polytunnels we needed for the site. The planning application actually turned into quite a protracted process, but conversely, looking at the positives, we actually got the media involved, the local newspaper at the time, and I think even Facebook pretty back then, and actually built quite a lot of profile off the back of the planning application. We actually raised the profile of what we were doing, and actually helped us to establish or to get these 25 initial households signed up for their first shares in March 2010. So that was a very rapid run through of kind of our setup process, but just what I wanted to highlight is that you don't need a huge amount of, you don't need a huge number of people to be involved. I think it's quite important to have a couple of key instigators who are willing and prepared to donate significant time, energy and resources free of charge for a startup period, hopefully with a view to gaining paid employment further down the line. So I'll just kind of focus a bit more of that on kind of the early stages of your CSA. There's a few questions you might want to ask, things like, are you responding to demand from the community, or are you trying to generate demand? There are plenty of examples of CSAs where landowners, and we've got a couple here, there's people with land who are looking to diversify or start a new enterprise on their land. Conversely, it could just be a group of consumers without any farming experience who are looking to either access land to establish an allotment project or access land and build up a business with a view to employing a grower. So there's huge diversity in the roots of where CSAs start from. And I think, echoing something that Gareth said earlier, that's probably one of the greatest strengths of the CSA model, that under that umbrella of the annual commitment and sharing risks and rewards, there's huge diversity and a huge spectrum of schemes, from grower-led CSAs on one end of the spectrum to community-led CSAs on the other end of the spectrum. And all of them are CSAs, and all of them work to the strengths and experiences of the communities they serve. And I think it's really important not to get stuck on one particular model, but to recognize that you can adapt, diversify your CSA startup to the strengths and opportunities of your own community and the individuals involved. So these are just kind of initial prompting questions that you might want to ask in the very, very start. And I've highlighted here again that either way, you will need a handful of individuals who are prepared to invest time, energy and resources, like I say early on, without any pay, with the idea of getting a scheme off the ground. Early on, you will clearly want to identify what you're going to produce, how you're going to produce it, along with your market. So if you're looking at veg, you could choose to either produce as wide a range of seasonal veg as you can. You could start with a few varieties to make it easy, to scale up. Start with a few varieties in your first year and gradually expand. The other question you might want to ask is, are you going to be looking to employ a grower? Are you going to be a grower yourself? Or are you a community group who want to do all the work on your own without employing a grower? It could be a combination of both. Another question early on you might want to cover is whether you're looking to produce to organic standards, and if so, are you going to be certified as organic? Going back to our experience at the New Economics Foundation meeting, there was a clear demand for access to local seasonal veg, but there was no one in the room saying that they wanted that veg to be organic, whereas ourselves as growers and just individuals, the only way we could think of running a farm or could ever run a farm would be to farm to organic standards. But conversely, we also recognized that we had a connection to our local community, and we didn't necessarily need an organic stamp or subscription certification to convince people we were farming organically. So we farm, and we have done for the last 12 years, we farm to organic standards. We actually lease land on a farm that is certified, and we're audited every year as part of their inspection. But we choose not to pay the certification fee because it doesn't actually offer us any marketing advantage, because all of our members know us personally and trust us to farm to organic standards. So you may be in a similar situation, or you may also be in a situation where it does make a big difference to pay for organic certification. And I'm happy to take questions on that afterwards. In terms of your primary market, you need to really ask if your market's going to be defined by locality. It could also be defined by an institution. There's plenty of examples, particularly in Europe and the US, I can think of, where CSAs are run through universities or hospitals. Yeah, the other thing to ask is your distribution method, whether you're going to, you could, for instance, be distributing from a hub like a university or like a central collection point, or you could be doing door drops where you drop veg to people's doors. You could be doing a combination of both. From my perspective as a CSA purist, I would say the ideal is really what Canalside managed to do, which is to get your members to come to the farm to collect their veg, because on a very basic level, that reinforces every single week, that reinforces that connection from the consumers to the farm. And if you can make that model work and your members are willing to support it, I would say that would be the ideal to work towards, because in the long run, that can only foster a greater loyalty and greater support for the farm, because, like I say, they get that weekly reinforcement of why they're a member of the farm, the landscape, the weather conditions, the seasons, the growers, and all those things that go into building the CSA story. Just as an aside on that, we've got a very good friend in Belgium who runs a CSA on a field just outside Leuven called Het Oppenveld, and he's got about 400 members on about 7 acres. It's very bio-intensive, it's organic, but basically he doesn't harvest any produce at all. He just he grows all of the produce with himself and another grower, and then every harvest day they put flags out in the field where produce is ready to harvest, and they write on the board what the share is that week, and the members have to come out, go to the field with their bags or boxes and harvest their own produce, take it back and weigh it to make sure they're taking the right amount, and then go off back to their homes. But that, for me, that is kind of the pinnacle of what CSA should be trying to achieve in terms of the integration of consumers to the farm and putting them in touch with their food. The other benefit of that, obviously, is that he doesn't have to dedicate any time to harvesting, packing, or distributing his veg. So he's able to just concentrate on growing the veg himself. So it's a great example there. It's called Het Oppenveld in Belgium. Moving on to some of the practicalities of setting up your CSA. Obviously, one of the first things, if you don't already have a site, is identifying a site. So you could either be someone looking to buy land or looking to lease land. I should repeat really that we've run a successful CSA for the past 12 years on 2 rented fields. So we've never owned the land on which we've been growing. And I think there's nothing wrong with that model. I think it's a very viable model, and it's actually probably more common than having access to land or being able to buy land. The only thing you do want to consider is a long-term tenancy agreement. And I think I've got a bit on that further on, so I'll talk about that a bit later. But yeah, I think from the outset, I think it's really important to recognize that you don't get hung up on having to buy land and own land yourselves. Although Gareth can give you some great examples of how Canalside have gone about doing a share issue to buy their land. There are a few options along that line, but certainly renting land can be a really accessible way to get into growing or even producing livestock on a small scale. So whatever you're going to be doing, you want to identify an ideal site or the most ideal site you can get for vegetables. Obviously, one of the most important things is south facing. If you can get it, well draining, if possible. These are all ideals. You can certainly grow without these, but these things make it a lot easier. Deep soil, light soil, sheltered with access to water. If possible, if you're growing organically, access to a supply of manure. and good access to machinery and existing infrastructure. So any existing infrastructure, whether that's a shed, polytunnel, anything, is better than the bare field. But we actually had to do all of those things from scratch. We start with bare fields on both of our sites. Things to be wary of are frost pockets. It's really important if you're looking at a growing site to try and visit it every time of the year, particularly at this time of year on a cold, frosty morning, to see where the frost lies. Things like waterlogging in the winter, it's really important to be aware of where fields are going to be inundated with water and underwater for prolonged periods. Perennial weeds, things like couch grass, dock thistle, those can be really difficult to get rid of, and it's in many ways ideal to start, certainly without those project problems. You're going to have enough to contend with in your first few years. Other things are potential problems with planning permission. So yeah, our example, we live in the national park. I mean, I wouldn't choose, I wouldn't have a choice to live anywhere else. I've grown up here and I obviously want to live here for the rest of my life. And I wouldn't choose to start CSA outside a national park if I had a choice. But it certainly made our lives difficult over the past 12 years. And in terms of getting planning for infrastructure, it would have been a lot easier if we were growing outside a national park. Same goes for areas of outstanding natural beauty and triple SI areas as well. So just be aware of those sorts of things in terms of planning. And neighbours as well are very important. If you're going to be using the land, it's especially if you're going to be having community minded or community activity on the farm, it's really important to have supportive neighbours who will tolerate or at least support that kind of activity on the doorstep. For livestock, looking at sufficient pasture, outbuildings, again, water and good fencing. Looking at CSAs in particular, proximity to one or more of your primary markets is really key. Although I did talk about distribution hubs like hospitals or universities, despite that, it is really key to have some way of your members being able to access the farm, even if it's just for seasonal social visits, so they can at least experience maybe once or twice a year the farm and the landscape. And that's really helpful. In terms of securing tenancies, so there's, I've started off here already about this misconception that it's impossible for first-time farmers to access land. And I think that is quite a common perception, particularly among young people, in my experience, looking to get into farming, that it's just, they don't know where to go to try and access land. But in my experience, and this might be influenced by growing up in a rural area, but I've always discovered that you never really know unless you ask. And I think it's really important to have a go and just go and knock on doors. I mean, that was the way we found both of our sites, was just knocking on farmers' doors and asking for a bit of land to grow on. So I've given a few tips here if you're not used to doing this, just a few tips in terms of approaching landowners. So I think it's quite important to be enthusiastic but modest, and sort of explain that you're looking to start on a small scale, and ask if they know anywhere or anyone worth approaching, rather than ask them directly if they've got land to rent. It gives them time to kind of mull it over. And again, you might not want to be over the top about the community element in your first conversation. You might want to introduce that maybe at a secondary or third conversation. But emphasize that if you have experience, that you've got any, but if not, that you've researched the local market and identified a demand for your produce, so that you're thinking about an enterprise, you're thinking entrepreneurially. And I put here that as a general rule, farmers tend to be skeptical of new ideas unless they're their own, but they do tend to respect hard work and good business sense. So I think as long as you can present yourself as enthusiastic, like I say, an entrepreneurial, that can often tick a lot of boxes and open opportunities. And again, don't get disheartened. It may well take several months to identify the best site for your CSA, but you'll learn from every experience that you have. Once you've identified a suitable site and a supportive landowner, the ideal you want to ask for is a farm business tenancy, and you can search for them online. It's called an FBT. And there's plenty of templates online. Both of our sites have a 5-year annually renewable FBT. Means that we always have 5 years notice, and that automatically renews every year unless the landowner chooses not to. So that gives us plenty of notice if we are ever in a position where we need to look for a different site. So I think you want to try and negotiate that early on. You may have to accept in the first year, maybe a 1-year or a 2-year tenancy, but I think it's very unlikely that once you've started an enterprise that a landowner would then go back on a tenancy. Or in our experience, once you started running a successful business from a piece of land, most landowners are very happy that the land is being used and being productive, and particularly if it's providing a community service, that goes a lot in your favor as well. In terms of incorporation, the incorporation really is just the basic vehicle that your CSA has to register with Companies House. Don't get hung up on it. You might want to choose a vehicle initially that works for the first group of founders, and that might evolve over time into a different vehicle, and you can change over time. So I think, yeah, don't get too hung up on it. But as a rule, most CSAs tend to fit quite well with the CIC incorporation. There's two types of CIC. There's large membership, which means there's more members than directors, and it assumes that directors make the day-to-day decisions about the business operation, and that best describes a kind of grower-led CSA, like Chagfood was, and where you have a small core group of growers and directors who can make the day-to-day decisions about the business. Conversely, a small membership CIC is one in which all the members are directors, and it assumes that all of the members of the CSA have a say and make decisions on pretty much everything affecting day-to-day management of the business. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. Again, I'll go back to what I was saying about working to the strengths of the community and the individuals involved. And there's plenty of examples of where small membership CICs and community-led CSAs work incredibly well, and tick all of the boxes for the communities involved. So I think it's worth exploring both of those models if you're going down the CIC route. The one thing to bear in mind about CICs is that they have an asset lock, which means that the assets of the business are held in community ownership until dissolution, basically. So yeah, all of the assets, anything that's invested into the CSA will be in community ownership. That's something just to bear in mind from the start. Both of these CIC models have significant advantages in accessing funding. So of all 3 grants that we've had at Chagfood over the past 12 years exceeding £10,000 have only been eligible available to CICs or charities. So in terms of, if you are looking at accessing funding, the CIC route is probably quite attractive for a startup. The other one that is worth covering is private enterprise. So it's important to recognise that the CIC model won't always be the most suitable for every CSA. Consensus horizontal decision making can be challenging for some people, myself included. And in many cases, there's examples of CSAs that have established and operated successfully as private enterprises. Gareth CSA in St David's in Pembrokeshire is a great example of a private limited company CSA. And actually, we at Chagford, we transitioned from a CIC to a private company in the past 2 years. I've just put notes here on delivering your first season, just because there's some things that might not be obvious to those of you who are just starting out. So I think I did just want to highlight that it's safe to assume your first season will be one of your most challenging, simply because you're getting to know your site and developing your growing systems at the same time as building your membership, troubleshooting, and basically just getting to grips with how the CSA model works. So I think it's really important to be realistic about what you can achieve. Don't be over ambitious. I think if you are able to access any amount of funding or reserves, if you've got any savings to support yourselves in that first couple of years, that's a huge asset, because it can be challenging to meet your financial targets in the first couple of years. If at all possible, I was suggesting here to nail as much of the business operation well in advance of the growing season. So if we're talking about veg growing, probably in contrast to livestock production, the labour demand for livestock production is pretty year-round, apart from probably peaks for haymaking in the summer. With veg growing, there's quite a distinctive flow to the seasonality of the work. So from mid-March onwards, work kind of ramps up to a peak in late May. And then for June, July and August, you're kind of at peak season. And then in September, towards the end of September and October, your workload tends to kind of drop down a bit more. Certainly in terms of work demanded to be on the field, doing the propagation, cultivation, planting out, weedings, harvesting, all of that. And one thing to bear in mind is if it is your first season, is to try and make the most of those early months. Now, sort of January, February, early March, to get on top of all of those business operations side of things that otherwise would take up time in the busy summer months. So things you might want to cover is like membership. So ideally have members, if not signed up, or if not paying, at least signed up by the time the first seeds are sowing. Realistically, you could start signing up members in the autumn before your first harvest. And you could consider offering a discount to early bird members who are willing to to pay up front to help cover those first kind of seed costs, or initial compost, buying any compost, those sorts of things, the costs that come early in the season. A weekly email or newsletter, or even monthly newsletter, is quite useful in terms of building the story and building the narrative. And there's going to be plenty of photo opportunities in your first year, so really make the most of that. Use social media, at least much better than we do anyway, to kind of build that story with your new and fledgling members, to kind of get them involved in the narrative of how the farm is starting up. And there's something quite infectious about a project, particularly a community project that's getting going, that can really generate a lot of support and loyalty from the local community. So kind of make the most of that story if you can, using social media. Things like accounting, membership spreadsheets, try and get those sorted well in advance. We used, for the first 10 years, we were just doing everything on Excel. We've recently transitioned to a new bookkeeping accounting package, Xero, mixed with something called Go Cardless, which actually automatically manages our membership payments. So that's something you might want to phase in earlier, to help take the pressure off. Marketing, prepare your marketing materials, logo, website, flyers, posters, all of those things that you're going to need to get out sort of May, June of your first year, in advance of your first harvest. Try and get all those prepared in the sort of January, February time. Again, maybe set a date for a launch event in, I don't know, mid-June is quite a good time, just before your first boxes are likely to be ready, your first shares are likely to be ready. That can be a really good way of, when the farm is looking at its best, sort of in early June, before the weeds have really taken hold, to kind of get everyone to the farm, have a launch event, get people to see what you're doing. In our very early years, it was quite striking actually that it could be quite challenging to actually sell the concept of CSA to people who had never been to the farm. But as soon as people came to the farm to an open event or a summer open day, they suddenly got it. They could see the lines of veg, the beds of veg laid out, and the packing shed, and they really got the concept of what we were selling. So I think don't underestimate the power of actually getting people down onto the growing site, in terms of getting them signed up. Again, things like infrastructure, use the winter to get on top of essential jobs, fencing, polytunnels, irrigation, packing, storage facilities. And again, machinery, make sure your machinery is well serviced. If you do have machinery in your first year, use the winter months to keep on top of that. Just to give you an idea of how we've our growing site and membership model has evolved over the past 12 years. Actually, it only goes up to 2020 here. So it's a 10-year scale up, basically. So in our first year, we were growing on about 1.5 acres. We had 25 members, and we just did one box size. We were turning over about just under 7.5 grand with 2 growers working 5 days a week, plus regular volunteers. And importantly, we had this £38,000 of making local food work funding to get us off the ground. In our second year, we took on another ½ acre. We went up to 40 boxes, still doing one box size, and we turned over about 18 grand. Third year, took on another ½ acre again, went up to 50 shares. We introduced a large box for big families who wanted extra veg, and we got up to about 22 grand. And then we actually had 2012 was a really difficult year for almost every grower in the UK. It was a very wet summer, very low light levels. The quality and quantity of the veg was really bad. And for us, it was actually a really positive, quite strangely, it was quite a positive experience, because for us in our third year, it really underlined what I was saying about right at the very beginning about sharing the risks and rewards. Because at the beginning of that year, we had 50 members. And despite the fact that we only supplied, I think that year we only supplied for about 25 or 30 weeks of the season, we still had 45 members who were willing to support us for our 4th season. And to me, that really underlined the power of the CSA model. There were about 3 organic veg box schemes on a similar scale to us in Devon, just in Devon that year, that went out of business because of the hit from the season. So to me, that was one of our best years yet, in the sense that it really underlined the power of the CSA model. And of those 45 members who'd seen us through 2 good years and a bad year, we've still got about 40 of them with us today. So it really highlights the integrity of the model and how it can really help. Particularly with new enterprises. I'll just rapidly run through these. So a year later, we went up, took on another 2 acres pretty much, went to 60 shares. 2015, quite similar area. 2016, we introduced a 3rd veg box size. We introduced a small share, like a ½ share of veg bag, and we're around 75. We had always been struggling. We'd always had a target of about 100 shares to meet financial viability. And we were constantly kind of struggling to get, there was these sort of 3 years where we were struggling around sort of, between 75 and 95, struggling to get up to 100. And the thing that really made the difference was around here, where after actually a visit from Gareth and Dom from Canalside, they advised us to actually go year round. So we went from being an entirely seasonal CSA, only supplying for 30 to 35 weeks a year, to actually buying in veg during the hungry gap and keeping the boxes going year round. And despite, it's always been our aspiration to work towards the Canalside model, where we can produce all of that produce ourselves and store it and keep it going through the hungry gap, we're still not quite at that level. So we still buy produce in. But actually that difference from buying in produce allowed us to go up to 120 shares, basically. So that made the big difference. That was allowed us to get over that barrier and suddenly become financially a lot more viable. 2020, this small thing called coronavirus happened, and it suddenly, in about 3 weeks at the beginning of March, we took on 30 new members because Riverford stopped taking on customers, and my phone was ringing off the hook. And yeah, remarkably, despite all of the challenges it's brought for small CSAs like us, there has been a silver lining, in that it's really re-engaged people with where their food comes from, how it's produced, and it turned out to be that prompt that a lot of people needed. So that took us to 150 shares in the space of about 3 weeks back in 2020. So that's where we are today. Actually, that's their distribution method. So the members could be from a huge geographical area, but they actually come to an institution which acts as the distribution hub for the CSA. So it doesn't just have to be that you're growing for an immediate local community. I think it's important to point out that in the UK, we've had a very slow growth of CSA since 1994. When we started Chagfood in 2010, we were actually only about the 10th CSA to start. Canalside were running by that point, but up until that point, there had been a very slow growth in CSA box scheme or market models. And the reason for that is largely because of the organic box scheme model that started in the late 80s and was incredibly successful in encouraging and fostering small-scale horticultural enterprises throughout the 90s and the early 2000s.